Yá'át'ééh, my relatives. Good morning. This is Mark Charles. Actually, good afternoon in some parts of the country. Here on the East Coast, at just past noon. But I'm sitting here with my second cup of coffee, and I want to have an important discussion with you. In preparation for this episode, I was considering discussing several compelling stories: the Russian drone conflicts in Poland, the tragic wars going on in Gaza, Jair Bolsonaro's sentencing for plotting a military coup in Brazil, gerrymandering in Texas and in California, Nate Bargatze's hosting of the Emmys, and a failed pro wrestler versus MMA fighter televised event that went very, very wrong. However, a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago on September 10th at 12:23 p.m., another tragedy struck our country, one that has since consumed our thoughts and confounded our efforts to respond. I'm, of course, talking about the assassination of Charlie Kirk at a speaking event in Utah. And I'm sure even the fact that I'm referring to a shooting as an assassination is going to give more than a few people pause. So this morning, I want to explore the reactions, the hypocrisy, the silence, and the disturbing normalization of violence in our society. I want to discuss what happens when staged political rhetoric blurs the line with real world actions and emotions. And then what do we do? How do we respond when that line is crossed? So I invite you to grab your favorite morning or early afternoon beverage and join me for an important conversation over my second cup of coffee. My relatives, before we begin, I want to do like I always do and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from what is now called Washington, D.C. My people refer to it as Washington. It's the land of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the host peoples of the land where I'm living. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbling it is to be living, moving, breathing, existing on these lands today. So, Yá'át'ééh, my Piscataway relatives, thank you for your stewardship of these lands. Let me see who is on this morning and see who's joining the chat. There might be a few people jumping on already. I'm glad to see some people joining me. It's been a few weeks since I had my last second cup of coffee. I did do an interview about a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, regarding a run taking place in New Mexico. But I haven't really had a discussion and a conversation about some of the things going on in our world in almost a month. And one of the reasons for that is because over the last month, at the beginning of last month, we moved. We actually had to move. We still live in DC, but we moved to a new house. And so it took a little while to get settled into our new house, to get everything unpacked and packed and then unpacked, and then to get my studio set up again. And then I was gone for a few days on a writing retreat with Soong-Chan Rah, my good friend and former co-author from Unsettling Truths. And we met for a few days to do some writing. And then some family came to visit, and all good things, right? These are all very good things, but they've disrupted the schedule and kept things very busy. And so I had intended to literally do this podcast and talk about this 2 weeks ago on Friday, the 12th of September. But I had to keep postponing it, A, because I didn't feel like I was quite ready to talk about these issues yet, and B, just because there were so many things going on that it was really hard to focus and to get everything pulled together. So this morning, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about what's been going on. And as I said, right, and Mr. Phil Fox, Yá'át'ééh, my relative, thanks for joining, my brother. It's good to have you on here. I'm glad you could be a part of my second cup of coffee this early afternoon here on the East Coast. But so while I was taking this break, and I knew I was going to be not giving my podcast for at least a couple weeks, I was tracking the news stories of what was going on. I was following the stories about Poland and NATO and Russian drones invading Poland's airspace and how there was a response to that. I was following very closely the starvation and the violence going on in Gaza. I was reading articles about Jair Bolsonaro's conviction for plotting a military coup in Brazil and the White House's public support for him. I could do an episode just on that. Let me put the link for that story into the chat. So if you want to read that, again, just fascinating things kind of going on. Just reading from the story, this is from the BBC, reacting to the guilty verdict. Trump said he found it very surprising and compared it to his own experience. That's very much like they tried to do with me, but they didn't get away with it at all. And the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said that Brazil's Supreme Court had unjustly ruled to imprison former President Jair Bolsonaro and threatened to respond accordingly to this witch hunt, in which Brazil's foreign ministry reacted swiftly, posting on X that threats like the one made today by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio in a statement that attacks the Brazilian authority and ignores the facts and the compelling evidence on record, we will not allow to intimidate our democracy. It's a strange world we live in, my relatives. I was also following stories about, of course, the gerrymandering that's happened in Texas and the response of Democrats in California to gerrymander there and to reclaim some of the seats that Democrats lost in Texas due to gerrymandering, and they gerrymandered some Republican seats in California to kind of make that quote unquote even. I'll put the link to that story in here as well. And then there was, of course, the Emmys that happened. And I was actually really intrigued. I saw that Nate Bargatze was going to be hosting the Emmys, and I was reading some articles. And I'm a fan of Nate Bargatze. I've really enjoyed his comedy. We actually went to see him live in Philadelphia about 2 years ago as a family, and it was fun for us to go down there and see him live. But there was a lot of stories about his genius plan to keep speeches short during the Emmys. And of course, some people loved it, some people hated it, but it was an interesting story. And then several other stories came across my news feed during that break. And one that I found really compelling was kind of the transformation that Gavin Newsom is making in California. And here's a story I'm going to share to that. This was in the Wall Street Journal, titled Trump-like political style tweeting aggression. Oh, gerrymandering, Gavin Newsom's Trump-like political style tweeting aggression and gerrymandering in California. This is to fight Trump, Gavin Newsom acts more like him. And that is an interesting story. And then, of course, what I mentioned in my introduction, the failed experiment to televise the staged event between MMA fighter Rajah Jackson and pro wrestler Stuart Smith. Of course, the challenge with that is MMA is real and pro wrestling is staged and fake. And of course, that led to some very unfortunate and even disastrous occurrences. But then on Wednesday, September 10th at 12:23 p.m. Mountain Time, everything changed. And Charlie Kirk was assassinated at a public speaking event in Utah. Charlie Kirk, who I did not know before this assassination, he's the co-founder of Turning Point USA, a Trump advisor, and he's been focused really on youth support, especially among Gen Z, and really galvanizing conservative Gen Z people to engage politically. And so first I want to talk about why I made the intentional choice to refer to his shooting as an assassination. Because I know I've already had a few people ask me why I chose to use that. And it's because I looked up the definition of assassination. And assassination, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is the murder of a person, especially a prominent public figure, in a planned attack, typically with a political or ideological motive, sometimes carried out by a professional or hired killer. And that's what that was. I don't know if it was carried out by a professional or hired killer, but it was a very intentional attack at a political event, single bullet, very planned, right? This fits the definition of a assassination. And so I made the choice, might even be a controversial choice, to refer to Charlie Kirk's shooting as an assassination, but that is truly what it was. And I think we need to wrestle with it in that light. But this was the reaction that happened, right? And I'm sure you know the story about this, and you followed the news if you've been at all reading anything over the past 2 weeks. This is all our media has been able to talk about. But there's the story in the AP News about the killing of Charlie Kirk and some of what went on around that. And I just want to walk through kind of what I observed as our nation struggled to react to this. Initially, Republicans and Democrats alike were swift to condemn Kirk's killing. Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom, this is quoting from the AP News article, who last March hosted Kirk on his podcast, posted on X, said the attack on Charlie Kirk is disgusting, vile, and reprehensible. President Trump ordered flags lowered to half staff and issued a presidential proclamation. The president, who sustained a minor ear injury when he was shot at a campaign event last year, said he and Kirk had a close relationship. He wanted to help young people, and he didn't deserve this, Trump said on Friday. That was from the AP article. Other prominent politicians, President Trump, obviously, Cory Booker, Chuck Schumer, Ted Cruz, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, former President Obama, the Clintons, and even Linda McMahon, the Secretary of Education, all condemned this in one form or another on their public social media, stating in some way that violence does not belong in our politics and this is a tragic killing. AP News ran an article regarding this shooting, and it was the article was titled, I'm just going to share this up here. Now, it was politicians who have experienced violence directly react to the shooting of Charlie Kirk. And it gave some reactions from politicians from both sides of the aisle who had experienced violence directly and some of their reactions to this. As I said earlier, this recently, Gavin Newsom, the California governor, has been mimicking Trump on his social media. He's been calling people names. He's been mocking people. He's been live tweeting kind of a stream of consciousness throughout the day, and he's been gaining supporters and everything else. And there was an article in Newsweek, which I'm going to share here now, how even he began to pause that. He paused his trolling barrage after this assassination. And then, of course, we all know there was the comment by Matthew Dodd on MSNBC, who began referring to and questioning some of Charlie Kirk's words and what he said, and got a swift reaction and was actually fired from MSNBC for the words that he said and shared after this shooting. And then we all know, of course, about Jimmy Kimmel, who was essentially taken off the air. They called it indefinitely. I think it was just a few days. But there was swift reaction to his response and his reaction to that. It was also fascinating to watch President Trump's response, right? Charlie Kirk was a huge fan of President Trump, worked hard, tirelessly to gain support among youth, especially Gen Z, into kind of the MAGA movement, and was very well liked by President Trump. And he actually delivered remarks. I don't know if it might have been on Wednesday or just right after, the day after. I think it was actually on Wednesday, after the shooting, after the assassination. And he delivered remarks, again, lamenting and mourning the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And then began talking about the tragedy of political violence. And this is, again, where it gets problematic, because President Trump listed several examples of political violence we've seen recently, but he ignored any political violence that came from the right and only focused on political violence that came from the left, including, not surprisingly, January 6th. He completely ignored that as well. And so he is framing the problem as only coming from the left and not being a problem for the right, except that they are on the end of political violence in the worldview of President Trump. The USA Today ran a story about this. I'm putting that in here now. And they actually compared Trump's response to the shooting, you might even call it the assassination of Melissa Hortman, the Minnesota state politician who was shot in her home by a man who had a list of other political targets, Democratic targets that he was intending to kill. After that shooting, Trump condemned violence, but said it would be pointless to reach across the aisle and call Minnesota Governor Tim Walz or to do anything else to mourn this more nationally. And yet Trump, of course, publicly lamented, made Charlie Kirk a hero, lowered the flags around the nation to half-mast, and he made no such gestures for Melissa Hortman. And so it's interesting, right? We need to observe the difference. Of course, Utah Senator Mike Lee, Republican from Utah, he got backlash after his very less than gracious tone regarding Melissa Hortman, and then his response to what happened in his own state with Charlie Kirk. And I'm going to share that. I'm not giving you a lot of articles, but this is an important subject, and I want to make sure that you're not just taking my word for it. But in this article, it said Lee offered a prayerful message following Wednesday's shooting and extended condolences to Kirk's wife and children while calling for swift justice. But the Republican struck a far less gracious tone in June, including a post on X that said "Nightmare on Walt Street," spelled W-A-L-T-Z, a jab referencing Democratic governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz. Another post falsely stated, "This is what happens when Marxists don't get their way," while including an image of Boltier, the shooter, whose friends and public records described as politically right-leaning, having once even registered as a Republican in Oklahoma. Right? So we have all of these reactions, and our nation is struggling. It became almost impossible to think about, talk about, or even critique the rhetoric of Charlie Kirk. Because the moment anything he said was brought to the forefront, it was condemned as believing this was the speaker of that, or whoever's bringing that, was justifying his killing. And people were being very clear at least most people were very clear to say, no, this does not in any way justify this type of violence. But it became almost impossible to talk about what Charlie Kirk was saying, the rhetoric that he was using, and the message that he was giving at any point over the past 2 weeks. And people were literally losing their jobs, being taken off the air for trying to bring that critique in. Some of it well-intentioned and even done correctly, and others was probably much more partisan or much more too abrupt or brusque than it could have been or should have been. But then when our leaders, the people in power, are condemning political violence, but only highlighting violence coming from the left and moving towards the right, this makes it very clear about what sort of rhetoric against who and towards who is appropriate and what is not. And this now creates even greater tension. I want to frame this as a bigger picture. I want to go back to one of the stories I was thinking about talking about, even if it was just to mention it, which is the staged fight between Raja Jackson, an MMA fighter, and Stuart Smith, a pro wrestler. And again, the problem is MMA is real. They actually hit each other and get hurt. And pro wrestling is staged. And it's all about the show and the drama. And the problem is that our politicians, both from the left and from the right, are quick to refer to their political opponents as enemies, to mock them, to belittle them, to talk in absolute terms about them and against them. And this happens both on the left and on the right. And then when something happens, violence occurs, they all publicly lament at least the violence, but frame it towards their partisan side. I want to share this story. This is on CNN about the fight against Rajah Jackson and Stuart Smith. I'm going to put this into the comments here. I want to just highlight a few things from this story. It says, when asked about criticism of his son, more famous fighter Rampage Jackson, said the problem is everything got blown out of proportion and people thought that Rajah snuck into the ring and did that. And that's what the problem is. At this point, Rajah was in an act as a pro wrestler, but he ain't no bleeping pro wrestler. The promoters had no reason putting my son in that ring. CNN Sports reached out to organizer Knock X for comment, but in a previous statement, the group said the incident started as a scripted part of the show known as a work in wrestling, but was not intended to go as far as it did. The first article I read about this story was in the LA Times. I'm going to share that story with you too. In this story, I want to highlight a few things from this story. It says Rajah Jackson, MMA fighter, scheduled to fight pro wrestler Stuart Smith, also known as Suko Stu, in a staged event. Smith, who is hanging out in a parking lot with other wrestlers before the show, appears to hit the younger Jackson on the side of the head with a drink can. The two then face each other as others record the interaction on their phones. This is normal for pro wrestling, whose wrestlers see themselves as always in character, even in public. But Rajah Jackson is not a pro wrestler. Rajah runs into the ring when the fight starts and, according to the LA Times, picks up Smith and slams him down with the back of Smith's head slamming into the mat. Jackson then immediately begins to deliver 23 punches to his face as the crowd looks on. Last week, Rajah Jackson was arrested and charged with a felony. And the promoters were shocked, said, we didn't intend this to happen, but they literally put an actual fighter in the ring with an actor. Someone who fights for real and someone who is putting on a staged event. How does this relate to our politics? Our politicians may just see themselves as doing their jobs, galvanizing voters, raising money, contrasting themselves with their political opponents. Behind the scenes, they might even be civil to one another. I remember in the house we lived in, before we moved to our current house, we were literally right across the street from Gallaudet University, the University for the Deaf. Just a few miles, a mile and a half from Capitol Hill. And every year, I think it's in the spring, there's a congressional baseball game where the two parties play each other in a baseball game, and they practice at the baseball field at Gallaudet University. So I would run on campus, and I would, certain times during the year, I would see them practicing there. There was, of course, security around. And they weren't yelling at each other. They weren't fighting each other. They were two teams civil, very civil to one another as they were preparing for this event. But on the political stage, on their social media, when they're acting in character, they speak and sometimes even behaved as if this is a staged drama and they don't believe anyone's going to get hurt. Where this becomes problematic, I want to give you another story here. This is by the LA Times about Gavin Newsom's transformation to mimic Trump. I want to just read some things from this story. The story is titled, Newsom Teaches Democrats the Art of Trolling Trump. The California governor has amped up his social media presence, mimicking Trump in a stream of consciousness, all caps posts on X. He recently called the president a snowflake, accused him of wearing makeup, and highlighted Trump's bad polling. Newsom's new approach has delighted many Democrats who have otherwise felt powerless to take on Trump. Newsom's effort has already raised more than $15 million to fund the campaign to pass the new gerrymandering maps, according to a state filing of high-dollar donations and the campaign's tally of online donations. From Republicans, he has earned further scorn. The article goes on in referencing the redistricting in California in response to what happened in Texas. Democratic leaders, for now at least, see no peril. Former President Barack Obama has endorsed the idea. Other potential presidential candidates have applauded Newsom's decision, including Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. He tried the respect thing, said Gary South, a longtime California Democratic strategist who has worked with Newsom. It doesn't work with Trump. He just thinks you're a sap. He just thinks you're a sucker. He said more Democrats should follow Newsom's lead. The problem is voters, the public, people who lose jobs because of policy decisions, people who can't pay taxes because of votes in the House or the Senate, people who have children arrested or put in jail or even other actions of injustice happen because of what happens, some very real consequences for what happens in Washington, D.C. They don't see the line between staged and real the same way our politicians do. And this could lead to them becoming radicalized and even resorting to violence. And this was very clear on January 6th, where Trump said, I didn't call for the violence, but his supporters delivered it anyway. Trump is a master at blurring the lines between stage rhetoric and reality. And that makes violence much easier. How do we know this? Well, we know this because something else happened on September 10th at precisely almost exactly the same time. At 12:23 p.m. Mountain Time in Colorado, calls began coming in to the 911 because there was a shooting at Evergreen High School in Colorado. And officers were dispatched at 12:24, 1 minute after Charlie Kirk was assassinated in Utah. It was a horrific event. I'm going to share a story about this. Here's the AP News. A student is dead after shooting 2 teens in his Colorado high school and then himself. In a local newspaper, our news story by Colorado Public Radio, they ran this story. What we know about the Evergreen High School shooting. This is from that story. The shooter, a 16-year-old student at the high school, took a revolver and loads of ammunition to school. The student waited until around lunchtime to start shooting. He reloaded his handgun multiple times as he made his way through the school looking for targets, said Jackie Kelly, a spokeswoman for the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. He would fire and reload, fire and reload, fire and reload, Kelly said. This went on, and as he did that, he tried to find new targets, and he came up against a roadblock on many of those doors, which apparently were locked. He couldn't get to those kids. Sheriff officials said the shooter fired about 20 rounds in about 9 minutes. And I looked. Almost none of our national politicians mentioned this. When I looked 2 days later, on Friday, September 12th, I checked the Truth Social and X accounts of Donald Trump, Cory Booker, Ted Cruz, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, President Obama, Bill and Hillary Clinton, and even Linda McMahon, the Secretary of Education. They all said nothing on their social media about this shooting in Colorado. The only prominent politician I could find who said anything about it was Chuck Schumer, who mentioned it briefly in one of his posts. This lack of attention suggests a normalization of violence in our schools, in our society. So much that it didn't even warrant a response from most of our high-ranking, well-known national political leaders. Everyone was focused on what happened in Utah. And I absolutely agree. Violence in our politics has no place there. What happened to Charlie Kirk should not have happened. But violence does also not belong in our schools. In regards to all of the critiques on what Charlie Kirk said or didn't say, how he said it and when he said it, I'm not going to tell you what to think about that. To be honest, I've never heard of Charlie Kirk before he was assassinated. I never heard of him. I never listened to him. I didn't know what he was saying. I didn't know about him. I've since found his podcast. I've listened to some parts of some of his show. I'm going to just share it with you. I welcome you to listen to what he said. Rather than listening to what other people on social media are going to tell you that he said, listen to what he said. Go back and listen to it. I invite you to do that. I encourage you to listen to at least a few episodes and make your own decision. I think that's what we need to do in this day and age. We have to go back to the source. I do that so frequently. This is why I share so many links in my podcast. This is why I put all these in my show notes, because I want you not just to take my word for it, but to know where these things are coming from and what the sources are and what's being said. In regards to the shooting in Colorado, ABC ran a story. It was titled, "Colorado High School Shooter Was Radicalized by Some Extremist Network," the sheriff department said. He was radicalized by an extremist network. This is why I'm talking about these things. Because this is where this violence comes from. This violence comes from our words, our rhetoric, the way we talk about our opponents and make them into enemies, the way we mimic them and mock them and belittle them and dehumanize them. So I invite you I'm going to share some links with you. Here's Gavin Newsom on X. Read his rhetoric. Here is Fox News on X. Read how they post things. Here is Rachel Maddow from MSNBC on X. Read the way she reaches out to her followers and her supporters. And even in regards to Charlie Kirk, of course, many people have been saying his rhetoric was divisive. One of the things he was being called out for was his response to Simone Biles pulling out of the gold medal round of the Olympics in 2021. I found the episode where he spoke about that. I listened to what he said. It was troubling, the way he talked about it. And then finally, I invite you, if you dare, and I rarely even want to do this, listen to Donald Trump on Truth Social. Go down his feed. Listen to how he talks, to what he says, to the language and the words and the things that he uses. Listen to how he frames his opponents and people who disagree with him or who go against him. And why is this important? Because if you remember back to the January 6th shooting, and after Trump pardoned all of the people who were involved, or the January 6th insurrection, not shooting, the insurrection, sorry. And then Trump pardoned everyone who was involved in that. There was one person, last name was Hemphill, I forget her first name. She was known as Mega Granny. And she refused the pardon. I'm going to put this into the chat. She refused the pardon. This is the BBC reporting convicted U.S. Capitol rioter turns down a Trump pardon. She was tried and found guilty. She pleaded guilty. The story says Hemphill, who was nicknamed the MAGA Granny by social media users in reference to Trump's Make America Great Again slogan, said she saw the Trump's government as trying to rewrite history, and I don't want to be a part of that. We were wrong that day. We broke the law. There should be no pardons, she told the BBC. The Idaho Statesman, a news service in the state of Idaho, where she was from, broke that story. And this is what they wrote. Hemphill said she started noticing other rioters spreading misinformation and lies. We are not victims. We were volunteers, Hemphill said. Nobody went up to them with a gun to their head and said, you're going to go break a window. You're going to go destroy property. You're going to go push an officer. They had a choice. She said she began researching the election for the first time and concluded it had not been stolen. She now thinks of herself as having been in a cult. I got my critical thinking back and started doing my own research, which I'm guilty of not doing back then because they gaslight you so much, Hemphill said. It's really weird when you come out of a cult. It's like you look back and you go, what was I thinking? My relatives, violence has no place in our politics. Violence has no place in our schools. And violence has no place in our words. Dehumanizing, belittling, and mocking words and behaviors towards our opponents. We must learn to stop this. Political events and public education are not staged events. We can disagree on policy, we can disagree on implementation, we can disagree on funding, but we must remember our opponents are not enemies. Our words have meaning and consequences. Words can inspire, they can motivate, they can unite, they can divide, they can calm, and words can even radicalize. As children, we were told, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And that is not true. We must acknowledge the impact and the power for good and for bad of our words. Our relatives, how we speak, how we conduct ourselves, how we behave, has an impact on the world around us. I shared this story almost a year and a half ago when I started running. And the first time I went running, I'm not a runner, but I began barefoot running about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, not quite 2 years, maybe a year and 9 months ago. And I started running. For the past 25 years, I've woken up every morning, and not every morning, but many mornings, and I've gone to watch the sunrise. This is a spiritual discipline I do in the pattern of my Navajo people, from what our elders and ancestors have taught us about how to begin our days in prayer, watching the sunrise. But I wasn't doing the tradition completely. I wasn't running. You're supposed to run towards the east and watch the sunrise and then run back. And I wasn't doing that. And a year and a half, I decided to start running as I was getting healthier. I wanted to incorporate running, not as a sport or as an exercise, but as a spiritual discipline. I rarely time myself. I'm not trying to improve my speed. I'm not trying to increase my distance. I just run as part of my spiritual discipline. And the first morning I went running, my daughters noticed a difference in how I was driving. In DC, when you drive, right, your horn is an extension of your vocal cords, and you honk. Someone pulls in front of you, you honk. Someone stops too quickly, you honk. Someone starts walking in front of you, you honk. Someone doesn't start quickly enough after a red light turns green, you honk, right? You just use your horn. And it makes driving stressful. And I will admit, I was an active participant in this lifestyle here in DC. And after I started running, a few days later, the morning I started running, I was out driving that day. I was taking my daughters to school, and someone cut me off. And I slowed down, but I didn't honk. And my daughters looked at me and said, "Dad, what's wrong?" I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "You didn't honk at that person." They always hate it when I would honk. And I said, "I know, isn't that weird? Isn't that weird?" I said, "I'm still annoyed. I'm still upset that they cut me off. But honking would just increase my stress. They're already clearly having a bad day and in a hurry to get somewhere, not thinking about the safety of others. Honking will bring me into that stress and will increase their stress." I said, "It's not that I'm not annoyed or even bothered by what they did, but I have more," what's the word I'm looking for? I have more impulse control. I was able to recognize I felt this way, and I'm not going to follow my first impulse, which is the honk, which lowers my stress instead of increases it. And I notice after I run and when I run on a regular basis, I do have greater impulse control. I'm able to not react so quickly. Walking in beauty, eating healthy, sleeping well, being in nature, building constructive relationships, having compassion, empathy, and concern for people who disagree with you and even oppose you. All of these things are tied up in walking in beauty. Our words are tied up in walking in beauty. Even our social media is a part of our walking in beauty, how we conduct ourselves and how we interact there. And yet so much of what we are shown, what we are modeled, what is even expected of us is about not doing those things. It's about reacting and responding and belittling and bemoaning and turning our opponents into enemies and ultimately dehumanizing them. And so I want to encourage you, my relatives, find a way. You don't have to do exactly the same things I'm doing. You don't have to watch every sunrise or even run every morning. But what can you do to walk in beauty? How can you connect to nature? How can you eat better? How can you move more? How can you sleep better? How can you breathe better? How can you take care of yourself so that when the pressures and the demands and the tensions and the aggravations of the world that we live in come upon us, we don't respond reactively. We don't all caps tweet a stream of consciousness, mimicking and belittling anyone who might oppose us. Our words have power. Our words have consequences. Our words can heal and they can harm. Violence does not belong in our politics. It does not belong in our schools, and it does not belong in our words, my relatives. So this is my challenge. And this is only increasingly important, right? These are just some headlines from today. From today, where Trump is ordering a crackdown on domestic terrorists, which again, he's defining as coming almost solely from the left, doing violence against the right. We need to understand the root of our challenges. We need to look at the root of our causes and not just see our problems as partisan. I want to share another story with you. I saw this one this morning as I was reading the news. This was on the AP website. It's Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, I guess, since they renamed the Department of War, so the Department of Defense. The article is titled, Hegseth Says Wounded Knee Soldiers Will Keep Their Medals of Honor. So if you remember from the history I've taught, and others have taught, history that happened, is that the massacre of Wounded Knee, where 250 plus Native peoples were slaughtered by a Union army. 20 Congressional Medals of Honor were given to the soldiers who participated in that massacre. I think it was during Biden's administration in 2022, there was a review of those medals that was started. In the 1990s, there was a review of the massacre and an apology was given. But the medals weren't rescinded. They weren't rescinded. You see, it's easy to read this headline and say this is a partisan problem. But the Democrats, yes, the Republicans are saying we're going to honor this. But the Democrats didn't go far enough to actually apologize. They said the words of apology, but they didn't actually rescind the medals. Right? This is like the apology given to Native peoples in 2009. House Resolution 3326, the apology to Native American peoples. 7 bullet point apology. Mentioned no specific tribe, no specific treaty, no specific injustice. You had some nice lands. Our citizens didn't take it politely. Let's now just call it all of our lands and steward it together. And then it ends with a disclaimer. Nothing in here is legally binding. And no funds are going to be distributed in a result of this apology. Signed by President Obama. This denial of our nation's history, this resistance to take responsibility for what we've done as a nation is a bipartisan value. The right's a bit more blatant and unapologetic about it, but the left largely delivers the same consequences, just with nicer words. This is why I'm doing things like the Common Memory Tour. This is why I'm doing things like the writing I'm doing and even this podcast. Our nation does not have a common memory. Going back to the quote, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If we want community, we must create common memory. If we want healthy community. This is what we need, my relatives. If we want to learn how to walk in beauty, we have to learn how to wrestle with our past and how to even begin to take responsibility for it as a nation. I'm still working on my Common Memory Tour. I still have many events that I'm working to plan. I have several in the works. Nothing has been scheduled yet, but I have potential events in Wisconsin, in Chicago, in New York, other parts of the Midwest, in California, up in the Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of things that are kind of in the works. And if you would like to support me in creating this common memory and doing this tour, I invite you to follow my Common Memory Tour campaign on GoFundMe, and if you're able to, support it. And just like we saw, right, the problem, even if we look at what happened with Jimmy Kimmel, where he was taken off the air. Now, the problem is he wasn't told he couldn't say the things he said. ABC just said, we're not going to pay for it. We're not going to let you say it on our dime, on our platform. And this is the challenge, right? Is he still had his freedom of speech. ABC just didn't want to pay for it. And Trump didn't want ABC to pay for it. Disney to pay for it. This is one of the reasons I've worked as hard as I've worked over the past 2 decades to keep my voice as independent as possible, because I've learned long ago that most institutions and most organizations at some point will say to people who are trying to bring change, you can't say that here. You can't bring that into this conversation. We're not going to pay for you to say that on our platform. I've heard that from almost every organization and institution I partnered with over the past 20 years at some point in our relationship. And because of the individuals who support my work and the different streams of income I've been able to build, I've been able to say, well, I may not say it on your platform, but I'm going to say it. and I'm going to talk about it. And so if you want to help me keep my voice independent, my relatives, I invite you to join my Patreon. I invite you to join my Patreon, my relatives, and to help keep my voice independent and get more in-depth content of the things I'm talking about. These are important conversations. Our country struggles at a very deep level to wrestle with how this nation was built and what we've done. And because it doesn't know what to do with our history, it turns it into a partisan problem where they can blame their political opponents. Or they turn it into a marginalizational problem where they can blame the people on the margins. But our nation struggles deeply to wrestle with how this country was founded, how it was built, and what was done so that this country could be here today. It doesn't know what to do with those things. And this is one of the reasons we see all of this challenge to wrestle with things like this that are literally national tragedies. And yet we can't help but turn them into partisan issues. And so, my relatives, I appreciate you. I encourage you, if you haven't already, subscribe to my podcast on YouTube or follow me on Facebook. Subscribe to my podcast wherever you can get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of the other platforms. I want to continue to dialogue about these things. I'm excited about the ways that we can find to move forward and to bring more people into these types of conversations. But we have a lot of work to do, my relatives. Our nation is not walking in beauty right now. We are becoming increasingly violent, and that violence is becoming normalized, so much that we hardly even mention it in our schools anymore. Our language has become radical and binary and divisive, and we've lost touch with the humanity of people who we disagree with. And we need to change that. My relatives, thank you for joining me. I hope your second cup of coffee is as good as mine has been. Walk in beauty, my relatives. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakon.